The farmhouse stood alone, a silhouette against the dying light. A shroud of mist clung to the ramshackle structure like a half-remembered nightmare. The paint peeled, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Windows gaped like empty sockets, and the whole place seemed to sag under the weight of its own decay. He lived there. The townsfolk knew him only in passing. He was a man of few words, his name whispered more than spoken. Some said he was a recluse, others a hermit. All agreed he was a strange man. He kept to himself, his only companion the silence of the farmhouse. The townsfolk would see him on his rare trips into town buying supplies, or staring vacantly out of his dusty window. He was a shadow passing through their lives, a specter haunting the edges of their vision. No one dared to approach the farmhouse. It exuded an aura of unease, a palpable sense of wrongness. The very air around it seemed to crackle with unspoken secrets. The farmhouse was a monument to isolation, a testament to the darkness that can fester unseen. Stories circulated about the man and his dwelling like weeds taking root in the fertile soil of fear. Some spoke of strange lights seen flickering in the dead of night. Others whispered of unearthly sounds carried on the wind, moans, screams, and inhuman laughter. Animals were said to avoid the farmhouse, their instincts sensing a disturbance in the natural order. Birds would fall silent as they flew overhead. Stray dogs would cower and whine, refusing to approach. Even the insects seemed to avoid the place, as if it were cursed. The townsfolk would exchange nervous glances when the man's name was mentioned, lowering their voices, their eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. They spoke of a darkness that clung to him, a palpable aura of evil. The truth, they suspected, lay hidden within the walls of the farmhouse, a truth too terrible to contemplate. They feared what secrets the man kept locked away in that decaying prison of wood and stone. They feared the darkness that whispered his name. Before the whispers, before the fear, there was a boy. He lived within the walls of that same farmhouse, far from a home. It was a cage of his mother's making. She was a woman of unwavering faith, her love a suffocating blanket woven with threads of fear and guilt. She ruled their small world with an iron fist. Her word was law, her God, a vengeful deity watching their every move. The boy grew up in the shadow of her zealotry, starved for affection, for a kind word, for a moment of genuine warmth. His only solace was in solitude, escaping into the woods surrounding their home. The trees were his confidants, the animals his companions. He found peace in their silent presence, craving the freedom they embodied. But always the boy was drawn back to the farmhouse, back to the oppressive atmosphere of his mother's fervent prayers, back to the chilling sermons she delivered within their home. He was trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience, a prisoner in his own home. Her death was sudden, unexpected. The townsfolk whispered of a heart attack, a merciful end, they said. But for the boy it was the earth splitting beneath his feet. His world crumbled, crushing him under the weight of his newfound solitude. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. The silence of the farmhouse was deafening now, no longer a prison but a tomb. He wandered the empty rooms like a ghost, haunted by the echoes of his mother's voice. The scent of her lavender perfume lingered, a painful reminder of his loss. The townsfolk kept their distance, offering condolences from afar, but no one dared to intrude upon his grief. They left him to his solitary mourning, to the whims of his unraveling mind. He clung to the remnants of his mother's faith, but it was a lifeline frayed beyond repair. Her pronouncements echoed in his ears, distorted and amplified in the silence, twisting into something dark, something sinister. The seeds of madness were sown, finding fertile ground in his grief. Titled "A Glimmer in the Darkness," his mother's pronouncements echoed in his ears. Her words about the sanctity of the body, about the soul's journey after death, they became a perverse gospel. He clung to them with a fervor bordering on madness. He began to visit the local cemetery, a place of peace, of quiet contemplation. He would tend to the graves, whispering prayers for the departed souls, finding solace in their silent company, a reprieve from the crushing loneliness of the farmhouse. One night under a moonless sky, he dug up a grave. It was an act of desperation, of twisted love. He sought to understand the mysteries of life and death, to bridge the chasm that separated him from his mother. He carried the unearthed coffin back to the farmhouse, the weight of the dead body inside chilling him to the bone. He laid it out on the kitchen table, the only source of light a single flickering candle. He stared at the lifeless form, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling a thrill of excitement mixed with terror. In the line crossed, the dead, he realized, held no fear for him. They were silent companions, their lifeless eyes reflecting his own fractured psyche. He began to see them as his muse, their bodies, his canvases. He delved into anatomy books, studying the intricacies of the human form. He saw beauty in the grotesque, art in the macabre. He began to experiment, driven by a twisted sense of purpose. His tools were crude, his methods unorthodox. He dissected the bodies with a butcher's precision, removing organs, stripping flesh from bone. He was no longer content with mere observation. He craved creation. His farmhouse became his laboratory, his sanctuary. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, the walls stained with the evidence of his dark experiments. He was crossing a line he could never uncross, a descent into utter madness. In the harvest of the unseen, the cemetery became his hunting ground. He would prowl the freshly dug graves, his heart racing with the thrill of anticipation. He was no longer a grieving son, he was a predator. The townsfolk whispered about missing livestock, about pets found mutilated. They blamed wild dogs, coyotes, anything but the truth that lurked in their midst. They were blind to the evil that walked among them. His excursions grew bolder. He ventured further afield, drawn to the anonymity of the city. He would frequent seedy bars, preying on the vulnerable, the lost souls wandering the streets. He was a phantom, snatching victims from the fringes of society. They would vanish without a trace, their disappearances dismissed as tragic accidents or the inevitable consequence of a life lived on the edge. He was a master of his craft, leaving no witnesses, no evidence, only the chilling silence of the missing. Whispers turned to screams. The whispers in town grew louder, the air crackled with unease. The townsfolk knew something was wrong, they felt it in their bones, but they couldn't pinpoint the source of their fear. Then came the screams. A local woman vanished. She was a fixture in the community. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the town. Fear turned to panic, panic to suspicion. The sheriff, a man hardened by years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer, organized a search party. They combed the woods surrounding the town, dragged the river, knocked on doors, but their efforts proved futile. The missing woman was gone, vanished without a trace. Her disappearance cast a pall over the town. It was as if a dark cloud had descended, smothering the once peaceful community in a suffocating blanket of dread. The townsfolk were living a nightmare, and it was only just beginning. The stench of sin. The farmhouse loomed. It stood at the edge of the woods, a monument to madness. The sheriff approached cautiously. His hand hovered over his holstered gun. He had seen his share of darkness, but something about this place chilled him to his core. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a putrid sweetness that turned his stomach. Flies buzzed around the entrance, drawn to the horrors that lay within. The sheriff took a deep breath, steeled himself for what he might find inside. He pushed open the front door. It creaked like a death rattle. The interior was dim, lit only by slivers of light that pierced through cracks in the boarded-up windows. Dust motes danced in the stagnant air. The silence was heavy, oppressive. The sheriff drew his gun, stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Each step he took echoed through the empty house. He felt a presence there, a palpable sense of evil that clung to the very walls. It was as if the house itself was watching him, judging him. He pushed open a door. The stench intensified. He gagged. It was the smell of death. A chamber of horrors. The room was a charnel house, a grotesque tableau of human remains. Skulls stared down from shelves, their empty sockets seeming to follow his every move. Bones were piled in corners, arranged in macabre patterns that defied comprehension. A workbench stood in the center of the room, covered in bloodstains. Surgical instruments lay scattered about, a scalpel, a bone saw, a pair of pliers, their tips stained crimson. The sheriff had seen enough. He knew he had stumbled upon something truly evil. He moved through the house, each room more horrifying than the last. Jars filled with preserved organs lined the shelves in what had once been a pantry. Human hair hung from the ceiling in the living room, braided into intricate patterns. A macabre tapestry of human suffering. The sheriff felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had never seen anything like it. The sheer depravity on display defied belief. He had to get out of there. He had to call for backup, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something in the corner of the room. Something that made his blood run cold. Echoes of madness. It was a diary. It lay open on a small table, its pages filled with frantic scribblings. The sheriff picked it up and began to read. The words swam before his eyes. They spoke of a descent into madness, of a mind consumed by grief and twisted by obsession. The writer spoke of his mother, of her unwavering faith, of her death. He wrote of his desire to cheat death, to resurrect her, to preserve her beauty for eternity. His words were filled with a chilling logic, a perverse sense of love. The sheriff flipped through the pages. He saw sketches of anatomical diagrams, notes on the decomposition process, recipes for preserving flesh. The writer's obsession with the dead was all-consuming. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The sheriff closed the diary, placed it back on the table. He had seen enough. He knew the man who had written these words was beyond redemption. He was a monster who had been hiding in plain sight, a monster who had been living among them. The skin suit. The sheriff entered the last room in the house. It was the master bedroom. The air hung heavy here, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, something that made the sheriff's skin crawl. In the center of the room stood a dressmaker's dummy, draped in what appeared to be a suit made of human skin. It was meticulously stitched, the seams almost invisible. The sheriff had seen enough horror movies to know what he was looking at. He approached the dummy cautiously. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the suit. It was cold and clammy beneath his fingers. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He could feel the evil emanating from the object. As he stepped back, he noticed something else. Hanging on the wall behind the dummy was a mask made of human skin. It was a perfect replica of a human face. The eyes were wide and staring, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. The sheriff had found his missing woman, or at least a part of her. The trial of the century. The trial was a media circus. Reporters from all over the country descended upon the small town. They crowded the courtroom, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward. They were hungry for a story. And this story, with its gruesome details and unsettling implications, was a feast. The man sat in the defendant's chair. He was pale and gaunt, his eyes vacant. He seemed detached from the proceedings, as if he were an observer rather than the subject of the court's scrutiny. He barely spoke. His only responses were mumbled whispers, barely audible above the cacophony of the courtroom. The prosecution presented their case with grim determination. They laid out the evidence in horrifying detail. The photographs of the farmhouse's interior, the missing person reports, the diary entries, the testimony of the medical examiner. It was a damning indictment. It painted a picture of a man consumed by a darkness he could neither control nor comprehend. The defense, a young, ambitious lawyer assigned by the court, mounted a feeble insanity plea, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. It crushed their efforts beneath its sheer depravity. The jury was left with no choice. They returned a guilty verdict after only a few hours of deliberation. Images of madness, the man's crimes, and the horrifying artifacts found within the farmhouse became seared into the public consciousness. Newspapers ran daily stories about the trial, their front pages plastered with gruesome images of the farmhouse's interior. The skin suit, the masks, the jars filled with organs. The public couldn't get enough. They devoured the details with a morbid fascination. The case tapped into a primal fear that lurked beneath the surface of their everyday lives, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the darkness that lurks within the human heart. The man's image, captured in a series of grainy police photographs, became synonymous with horror. His gaunt face, framed by unkempt hair, stared out from newspapers and television screens. His eyes, hollow and vacant, seemed to reflect the abyss that had swallowed him whole. The farmhouse, now a crime scene frozen in time, became a macabre tourist attraction. People would drive for hours just to catch a glimpse of the place where such unspeakable horrors had occurred. They would stand at the edge of the property, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. A legacy in fear. The man was declared legally insane. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his days in a secure mental institution. The judge, a stern woman known for her unwavering adherence to the letter of the law, declared him a danger to society, a threat that needed to be contained. He was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He showed no emotion, no remorse. He was a shell of a man, his mind trapped in a labyrinth of its own making. A prison far more terrifying than any the state could devise. The townsfolk, forever marked by the horrors he had unleashed upon their community, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over, but the scars, both physical and psychological, ran deep. They would forever haunt the town of Plainfield. The farmhouse, deemed too contaminated by evil to stand, was razed to the ground. The charred remains, a smoldering pyre of secrets and sins, were buried beneath a mountain of dirt and rubble. But the memory of what had transpired within those walls lingered. It was a stain on the town's soul, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic community. The ashes of memory. The farmhouse was gone, reduced to a pile of ash and rubble. The townsfolk had gathered to watch it burn, their faces illuminated by the flames. They stood at a safe distance, as if afraid the flames might consume them too. They watched as the fire consumed the last vestiges of the horror that had gripped their town. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and charred wood. It mingled with the lingering stench of decay, a final acrid exhalation of the evil that had festered within those walls. The flames danced and swirled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the faces of the onlookers. Some wept openly, others stood in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The fire was a catharsis, a purging of the darkness that had threatened to consume them all, but it could not erase the memories. The scars ran too deep. As the flames died down and the smoke began to clear, the townsfolk turned away. They returned to their homes and their lives. But they knew that things would never be the same. The farmhouse might be gone, but its legacy of horror would endure. Specters in the silence. The town of Plainfield slowly began to heal. The initial shock and horror gradually gave way to a dull ache of collective trauma. Life went on, but the memory of the farmhouse lingered. It was a ghost that haunted their waking hours and invaded their dreams. The silence was the most unsettling change. The once familiar sounds of rural life now seemed amplified in the absence of the man and his gruesome activities. The chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, the rustling of leaves in the wind, they were constant reminders of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface. Parents held their children a little closer. Neighbors eyed each other with a mixture of suspicion and fear. The once unbreakable bonds of community had been strained, tested by the horrors they had endured. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. The stories persisted, whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors. Passed down from one generation to the next, they became a part of the town's folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of looking away, of ignoring the signs of evil. The enduring shadow. The man's name became synonymous with horror. He was the bogeyman, the monster in the shadows. Parents would whisper his name to their children to frighten them into obedience. His crimes, recounted in gruesome detail in true crime books and documentaries, became the stuff of nightmares. The farmhouse, though long gone, lived on in the public imagination. It became a symbol of the darkness that can lurk beneath the veneer of normalcy. A stark reminder that evil can take root anywhere, even in the most idyllic of settings. The man's legacy extended beyond the town of Plainfield. It seeped into popular culture, inspiring countless horror novels, films, and television shows. His crimes, fictionalized and exaggerated, became a source of both entertainment and unease, a reflection of society's morbid fascination with the macabre. The horror genre, once relegated to the fringes of literature and cinema, experienced a surge in popularity. People flocked to theaters and bookstores, eager to confront their fears in the safe confines of fiction. The man's crimes, though horrific, the question still remains, who am I?